Coming up on Warplane, the arrival of the jet engine transforms aviation, and aircraft push beyond the speed of sound.
The rocket craft cracked the sonic barrier.
With Cold War stakes escalating, pilots must prepare for a new kind of combat.
We needed an airplane that gets supersonic speeds very, very quickly.
And the warplane takes on new forms.
That essentially was the birth of the attack helicopter.
But the warplane isn't all about attack. In its role as intelligence gatherer, the surveillance plane has to avoid enemy defenses. To do so, it flies higher, then faster.
Designers faced the problem of having an engine that would work all the way from takeoff up through Mach 3.
The warplane becomes almost invisible and autonomous.
Human performance is clearly the limiting factor in our modern high-performance aircraft.
Conflict drives technology on Warplane.
From the very first time warplanes flew into battle in 1914, they were forced to evolve. As more and more was expected of them, they exposed weaknesses in structure and design that had to be overcome. Struts and wires gave way to streamlining, and cloth and wood to aluminum and steel. Years of combat led to more durability and speed. But only rarely did an innovation come along that made everything before it obsolete. The jet engine was one of those advances. Its arrival ushered in a new era of military aviation. Today's jet fighters represent the state of the art in the continuing evolution of the warplane. In only 100 years, technology has made the impossible seem simple and pushed the limits of aerodynamic design. From new materials to bigger and more powerful engines, and from advanced avionics and computers to sophisticated weapons and wings. The result is a range of aircraft superbly designed to meet exacting mission criteria. The missions were established over the battlefields of 2 world wars and the many smaller conflicts that followed. By the end of World War II, the piston-engine propeller plane was an effective military machine. But as airplanes approached speeds of 500 miles an hour, the propeller's efficiency began to drop off dramatically. It simply couldn't function at such high velocity. A technological limit had been reached, and a fundamental change in engine design was needed to overcome it. Here in Warton, England, a new breed of warplane is being readied for flight. It's the European answer to the widely used American F-16, and it has all the latest advances. Its body is made primarily from super strong but lightweight carbon fiber composites, and its wings and flight surfaces are designed for speed and agility. Called the Eurofighter Typhoon, the plane is the culmination of 10 years of development and 100 years of knowledge. At its heart is a fiery power source that first saw action just as the piston engines were reaching their outside limits.
The jet engine as a design item actually had occurred to people even before the First World War, but the first major figure to really study it intensively was Frank Whittle.
Frank Whittle's son Ian is a pilot in his own right and has had first-hand experience with his father's technological legacy.
My father had a vision of aircraft flying at very high speeds at very high altitudes when he was very young.
His vision was for a new type of engine based on a revolutionary and somewhat frightening concept. ignite a mixture of compressed air and fuel between two connected fans, then harness the resulting force from the explosion to drive the plane forward. The concept was ahead of its time. Whittle proposed his idea in 1929, when he was a 22-year-old RAF officer, and piston engines were still adequate for the jobs they were doing. He took his concept to top RAF research scientist Arnold Griffith.
Griffith saw what he had to offer, and unfortunately, for reasons that nobody has really been able to work out, he told his mentors that the idea was not viable, and so the Air Ministry rejected it.
It was a huge blow for Whittle, but the decision would soon have far more widespread consequences. Within 3 years, the Nazis would begin their ascent from the rubble of the First World War. High on Hitler's secret list of goals was the development of the most powerful air force the world had ever seen. In 1936, he put his warplanes to the test in the Spanish Civil War, supporting the fascists of General Franco against President Manuel Lasagna's Republicans. The German Luftwaffe employed all the latest technologies, and its planes rained down terror from the sky. By 1935, a young German physicist named Hans von Ohain had come up with his own plan for a jet engine and attracted the backing of Ernst Heinkel, one of Germany's preeminent airplane manufacturers. In England, Frank Whittle and his team were forced to undertake their research with far less support.
They could never do anything more than build one engine. So when that engine broke down, then they had to repair it with what they'd got. They didn't have enough money to test the compressor separately, test the turbine separately.
But Whittle persevered, sometimes even at the expense of his own personal safety.
The testing of the first engine was a bit hilarious because, unbeknownst to them, some fuel had gathered in the combustion chamber arrangement they had, and they didn't know about this. So when they started it up, the engine started to pick up and it ran out of control.
This early reconstruction shows Whittle playing himself during the unruly engine test.
Father's standing there with the fuel valve, and he closed the valve off, and the engine accelerated away. He used to say that he didn't run away because he was so frightened he couldn't move. But I think it was his baby, and there was no way he was going to leave it.
As Whittle continued his slow and underfunded progress, the secret German jet program was moving forward at high speed. By 1939, Heinkel not only had a working engine, he had a working plane. On August 27, 1939, the Heinkel HE-178 took to the air. Whittle was still behind, but his determination was beginning to pay off with the RAF.
By mid-1939, the thing was demonstrating itself to be a very good piece of technology. And of course, that's 10 years after he'd presented the idea to the Air Ministry.
10 years after he'd presented it, and only months before the beginning of World War II. With conflict looming, England's military commanders finally awakened to the potential of Whittle's design.
The director of scientific research came to see the engine and realized that the turbojet was the way to go into the future. But of course, by then, the outbreak of the war was upon us. People had other things on their minds, but at least the Air Ministry ordered an aeroplane.
After waiting so long, even a single airplane was better than none. And in May of 1941, Frank Whittle finally saw his engine take to the sky aboard the experimental Gloucester E-28. But the Germans were still far out in front. They had gone beyond the experimental stage and had a working jet fighter ready for battle, the Messerschmitt Me-262. With its two jet engines slung in pods beneath its wings, the Me-262 was 100 miles per hour faster than the fastest Allied piston engine fighters. On July 25, 1944, the Me-262 became the first jet-powered warplane to see action.
When Adolf Galan, the famous German ace, made his first flight in the airplane, he was simply swept away by it. He said it felt as if it was being pushed by the angels, and he immediately wrote to Goering that this is the airplane that should go into production because it gave him an immediate advance over Allied aircraft.
The Me-262 did go into production. Although output was kept small by Allied bombing, its arrival signaled the beginning of the end for piston engine aircraft. The British, now full of urgency, followed only weeks later with the Gloucester Meteor, the RAF's first production line jet fighter. After 15 years, Whittle's vision was finally vindicated.
When the Meteor became operational, all he could say really was well, about time too.
At de Havilland Aviation in Bournemouth, England, one of the last airworthy Meteors is still flying. RAF Captain Eric Brown was one of the first pilots to fly it.
Moving from piston engine to a jet-engined aircraft was a revelation. I think the first thing that struck one was the fantastic view. No propeller ahead of you, and no large, long-nosed piston engine.
Although the Meteor and the Me-262 entered service at almost the same time, they never met in aerial combat. The British deemed their plane too valuable for enemy skies and limited its use to the defense of England. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe finally ended. 2 days later, Eric Brown was ordered into the rubble of Germany. He was sent to find out about and get his hands on a working Me-262.
When I first saw an Me-262, it looked a very lethal airplane. It reminded one vividly of a shark, and the whole thing was just an aspect of lethality. And by far, in my opinion, the most formidable aircraft of World War II.
Here in Seattle, Washington, aviation engineers are servicing a replica Me-262. A closer look inside the engine reveals that it was considerably different from Frank Whittle's.
There was a striking difference in engines that the 262 used, the Yomo 004 and the British Meteor.
Both jet engines produced similar thrust, but there was a fundamental divergence in the way they breathed. The Whittle approach used one large compressor disc at the front of the engine. The disc forced air outward centrifugally into combustion chambers that encircled the central disc. It was called a centrifugal engine.
The air is drawn in here. It is compressed by the single disc with the blades on. When that air is compressed, it comes out of there and is curved round through these vanes and takes the air pressure straight into the flame tube. Once that air pressure is sufficient, we introduce fuel. So now we have a mixture of air pressure and fuel. Everything okay? The pilot then presses the switch and it lights it. All these are interconnected and they go woof.
The German axial flow engine was entirely different. Instead of one large disc and peripheral combustion chambers, it used a series of small discs that compressed the air tighter and tighter into one central combustion chamber.
The Germans went very quickly with axial flow compressors, which means the air is being accelerated along the axis of the engine.
Although both designs worked, the axial flow engine offered some unique advantages as power was increased. In order to generate greater thrust, more air had to be sent to the oxygen-hungry burners. In the centrifugal engine, the only way to force more air into the combustion chambers was to increase the size of the disc, making the engine fatter and less aerodynamic. But on the ME-262's axial flow jet, engineers just had to add more compressor discs to increase the airflow. This meant a longer, more slender engine, far better suited for sleek fighter planes. But in 1944, the axial flow engine did have one big disadvantage.
Materials available in those days just did not withstand the stresses and the temperatures that these engines developed.
In the ME-262, the small, finely engineered compressor blades were particularly susceptible to the high temperatures generated during flight. Its engines only lasted an average of 25 hours before the blades gave out, even less if the fuel flow wasn't carefully regulated by the pilot.
Pilots had to religiously adhere to not moving the throttles too fast. Just very, very slowly, at snail's pace, moving up and moving them back as well. And you can imagine in the heat of battle, forgetting about it and moving the throttles very quickly here in this airplane, the engine would flame hot.
As one of Britain's top pilots, Eric Brown was expected to test captured German warplanes. It was a hazardous job.
The first German jet I flew was the Dorado 234s, the reconnaissance bomber twin jet. Same engines as ME-262. I taxied it out to the end of the runway, ran up the engines to full power, and was just about to release the brakes for takeoff when the starboard engine exploded, blew clean out of the airframe, taking most of the starboard wing with it.
In the early 40s, the strong metal alloys required for a safe axial flow engine were in short supply. The engines were prone to self-destruct. Eric Brown's experience was not an isolated incident. Frank Whittle had foreseen this problem, which is why he had opted for the simpler centrifugal engine. The fact that this 60-year-old Meteor is still flying with its original engines stands testament to his engineering prowess. This replica ME-262, on the other hand, while exacting in its attention to authentic detail, flies on modern Pratt & Whitney engines. All the originals are long gone. But although the engines themselves had no lasting power, it is their legacy that ultimately won out. With the development of metal alloys containing molybdenum and titanium in the 40s and 50s, materials eventually started to catch up with the axial jet's design. As the blades and compressor fans got stronger, they were better able to withstand the stresses put on them during flight. The engines got more durable, which meant they could be made bigger and more powerful. Today, almost all modern warplanes use the axial jet blueprint. And although they've gotten more complex, the principles on which they are based have changed little through the decades. Here in Wharton, England, at one of the assembly bases for the Eurofighter Typhoon, test pilots are fine-tuning the plane as it prepares to enter service for the UK, Spain, Germany, and Italy. The plane's engines, called EJ200s, are built by Rolls-Royce. They can generate 42,000 pounds of thrust, 50 times more than Frank Whittle's first engines. The Eurofighter Typhoon has 2 of them. It can get airborne in 8 seconds from a standing start and reach the speed of sound only 30 seconds later. Back at the end of World War II, jet planes weren't going quite that fast, but each generation of engines did allow the most daring pilots to push the speed envelope. As the engines got more powerful and the pilots more skilled, the planes themselves became the limiting factor. On September 27, 1946, a 36-year-old test pilot named Jeffrey de Havilland Jr. set out to make history. He was attempting to beat the world speed record of 616 miles per hour. His aircraft, the DH-108 Swallow, was a prototype built by his father's company. De Havilland would be flying close to the speed of sound, at sea level, 760 miles per hour. The flight started well, but at Mach 0.9, just a hair shy of the sound barrier, the plane disintegrated. The death of such an experienced pilot shocked the aviation world. Following the crash, another Swallow prototype was built. Small modifications were made to try and increase safety and stability. Test pilot Eric Brown was given the opportunity to fly the plane, but it wasn't long before his world too began to shake apart.
You had an airplane going along and literally doing this. Almost a blur, it was oscillating so violently. With the G, I couldn't get my arms up to reach the blind and pull the blind to eject.
Fortunately for Brown, his experience and instinct kicked in, and he managed to ease back on the controls.
After 7 seconds of this, it stopped as quickly as it had begun.
Once again, Brown had survived at the limits of technology. Around the world, aviation engineers were struggling to understand what was going wrong.
All the leading nations of the world had very serious problems with high-performance fighter airplanes going out of control or beginning to go out of control as they flew faster and faster.
Progress on jet airplanes ground to a halt. Little was known about the practical effects of high-speed flight, so new wind tunnels were constructed to simulate transonic speeds, those close to the speed of sound. Using Schlieren photography, a visual process for imaging airflow, scientists saw that high-pressure areas were forming all over the aircraft.
This was the so-called compressibility crisis, or the beginnings of the whole problems involving the so-called sound barrier.
Shock waves at transonic speeds were the cause of the instability.
Transonic is a region of flight where you have supersonic flow over part of the aircraft and subsonic flow over part of the aircraft. It's a very difficult region to understand, even today, because you have this mix of flows between the two. Fully supersonic and fully subsonic are relatively easy to understand, but this transonic region becomes more difficult because of the different areas of the aircraft that are obeying different laws of aerodynamics. The way this is manifest to the pilot is that the shock wave moves back and forth very rapidly over the top of the wing, many, many, many times a second.
The thick wings had not been designed to handle such shock waves.
Now, what I'm showing here is a typical wing about 12% thick, which means that that distance there is 12% of that distance. If you could say slim that down to 6%, the effects of the shock waves might be put off so you could go faster before you would get into these problems.
History was about to turn full circle. The early planes had used thin wings, designed to slice through the air with as little disturbance as possible. But as the study of aerodynamics evolved during World War I, scientists had discovered that a thicker design generated more lift by forcing more air over the top surface of the wing. The thick wing could also accommodate wheels, weapons, and struts, eliminating the need for biplanes and triplanes. The move from multiple thin wings to single thick wings had revolutionized the airplane. But now, the powerful jet engine had made the traditional thick wing a liability. A new adaptation was needed if planes were to withstand the forces of transonic flight. Despite all the modern testing, the answer seemed to be a return to a pre-World War II German design, one using a modified thick wing that actually appeared thin to the oncoming airflow. It was called a swept wing.
So we now have exactly the same thickness there, but we've got a much longer distance, so it's relatively more slender.
The innovation of the swept wing is easy to see. It immediately gives a plane a fast, aggressive profile.
This is no longer the straight wings, old-looking things with a jet engine slapped on. This is a real modern fighter as we think of it today as a jet fighter.
The F-86 Sabre, which first flew in 1947, was one of the earliest planes to take advantage of the swept wing design. Many thought it would be the first to break the sound barrier. But although it was powerful enough to get there, as it approached the speed of sound, vibration and buffeting still rendered the controls useless. In October of 1946, at Muroc Dry Lake in California, the Air Force tried a different approach, using a top-secret research craft with a radical design. It was small and had straight, razor-thin wings. Instead of a jet engine, it was powered by a rocket. Called the Bell X-1, it was designed for one purpose and one purpose only, to punch through the elusive sound barrier.
The X-1 program, then called the XS-1 for Experimental Sonic 1, was a development program to try and develop a research supersonic aircraft capability.
With enough fuel for a 90-second powered flight, it was launched from the underbelly of a B-29 Superfortress. But as the Bell X-1 reached full power and approached the speed of sound, the aircraft spun dangerously out of control. No matter what the pilot tried, the control surfaces at the rear had no effect until the plane slowed down. The engineers shifted their focus from the wing to these tail-mounted elevators. This is a model of the X-1's tail. When the control surfaces are raised or lowered, they press against the oncoming air, forcing the whole rig up or down, steering the plane. As the wind tunnel is powered up, the elevators start doing their job, pushing the rig up as they go down and down as they go up. In this test, the wind speeds are well below the transonic danger zone. When smoke is added, it's easy to see the smooth airflow around the aerofoil. But as the plane goes transonic, shock waves on the wings create turbulence for anything in their wake. This causes the elevators on the tail to operate in dead air, rendering the controls useless.
So what happens is the airflow, instead of flowing smoothly back over the trailing edge of the wing, is that it separates, and you have this large dead wake caused by this shock wave. The problem is all the control surfaces are right there in this dead wake, and so you lose a bit of control authority when this happens. And so there's a very real danger of a pilot not having the fine control that they're used to having.
The pilot needed some other way to maneuver at high speeds, and until the team figured one out, the Bell X-1 was not going to break through the sound barrier. This time, the answer would come from a British supersonic research project that had begun in 1942. Not surprisingly, Frank Whittle was involved. project, called the Miles M52, had been commissioned by the British government, and just as in the US, the goal was to build a craft that could fly faster than the speed of sound. Whittle's engine was big and provided a great deal of thrust.
It was estimated that they would be able to achieve a Mach number of about 1.1, or something like 1,000 miles an hour.
The M52 was to be piloted by none other than Eric Brown.
I had been alerted by the director of the RE that I would likely be the pilot to do the first flight in this and do the supersonic testing.
But as the project neared completion, the team received devastating news. Frank Whittle, ignored by his government in 1929 and shunned by his War Department in 1935, was once again left out in the cold. The British were abandoning the project.
Before the M52 was cancelled, we were instructed to give all the data to the Americans.
In the package sent to the U.S. was one technical innovation that stood out above all others: a movable tail.
In the flying tail, instead of having the moving bit, you make the whole tail solid, and then you move the whole tail, the solid tail.
Rather than only adjusting the small elevators on the rear edge of the tail, the pilot could pivot the entire tailpiece. This presented a much larger surface area to the oncoming airstream, allowing the tail to bite into the wind, even if the air was turbulent. The improvement was dramatic.
There's a very big difference between just using the elevator on its own, where, I mean, it moved hardly at all up and down, whereas moving the whole tailplane, we get a very big difference.
But the question remained, would the flying tail work when the plane was being buffeted by the transonic shock waves? The British Miles team believed it would, but never got the chance to put their theory to the test. Now, it would be up to the American Bell X-1 team to prove they had overcome the last hurdle that was keeping them from supersonic flight.
Now, success has many fathers, and there has been a historical debate on what the origins were of the all-moving tail on the X-1. Certainly Miles had pioneered in the development of the all-moving tail with the M52.
On the 14th of October, 1947, the modified Bell X-1 took to the sky with an entirely movable tail. It was a day that changed history. The plane handled perfectly, and the X-1 took Chuck Yeager to and through the sound barrier. The age of supersonic flight had begun with a bang.
The rocket craft cracked the sonic barrier. Human flight, faster than sound.
At first, Yeager didn't even realize he'd succeeded. He thought his speed indicator was faulty. But soon enough, he realized he'd gone faster than any human being before him. Today, all modern supersonic warplanes work off the same principles as the Bell X-1. They use large, movable tailpieces to maintain stability and control at both high and low speeds. Some, like the Eurofighter, also have control surfaces at the front. Called canards, they give the pilots even greater control and maneuverability during flight. Back in the late 40s, the F-86 Sabre was the first jet fighter to benefit from the all-moving tail. The original design was modified to include it, and although the Sabre was never considered a supersonic aircraft, it could reach the speed of sound during a powered dive and stay in control.
To this day, this aircraft is still regarded as one of the most beautiful aircraft ever built, even compared to other jets. The lines on it are so smooth, so clean, so flowing. You look at it and it looks like it's going fast.
Fast, but not battle-tested. Developed after World War II, the the Sabre had yet to prove itself in combat. But in 1950, it would get its chance in the Cold War skies over Korea.
Even though this was a contingency in a far-flung section of the globe, far removed from the conflict area of interest in Western Europe, that we were having a fight here in which we were having to employ the very highest state of our technology.
The Korean War was the first time jet fighters would engage with other jet fighters. The advanced American Sabre, with its powerful axial flow engine, would be going up against the Russian MiG-15, which used a centrifugal flow design. As a World War II ally, the Soviets had received the centrifugal engine from Britain and used it to create the chunky but dangerous-looking swept-wing MiG. The Sabre, on the other hand, had a more streamlined silhouette because its axial flow engine was longer and thinner.
These are the ailerons. The tail surfaces are hydraulic.
Gil Hassler flew 101 missions in the F-86 Sabre.
The aircraft carries 6 M3 50 caliber machine guns. Firing all 6 guns at the same time, you could feel the reduction of the aircraft slowing down because of that recoil in there that the whole aircraft was absorbing.
The Browning 50 caliber machine guns had been used effectively during World War II. They were fast, but not as lethal as the MiG's armaments.
They carried 2 23-millimeter rapid-fire cannons and 1 37-millimeter slow-fire cannon. When the 23-millimeter projectiles were going by my canopy, they looked like golf balls. And when the 37-millimeter projectile was going by my canopy, it looked like a tennis ball. And you could hear them because they're supersonic, like that.
The projectiles were deadly if they hit, but the guns were slow to fire. At speeds of more than 600 miles per hour, the weapons sometimes seemed like they were operating in slow motion.
In World War II, when they would look out, they would see fighters at a distance, but the jet fighter pilots had to learn to look at fighters a lot further out, so they had to see even better than before.
Firing bullets at a moving target from a moving plane was never easy. But with high-speed jets, it became all but impossible.
If the aircraft are turning around in any sort of way, then they might aim a gun in one direction, but in fact, it completely misses the target. So in order to compensate for the spinning motion, for the rotating motion, if I really do want to hit Ben with this ball, I have to throw the ball a bit to the left of Ben, like that, and there it goes, straight at him.
With the jet fighter, the problem, known as deflection, was far more pronounced.
You have both a moving target and yourself are sitting in a moving platform. And then when you start thinking that through, you have the bullets that you're firing, which themselves are affected by gravity, affected by wind.
To make matters worse for the MiG-15 pilots, they were using antiquated gun sights designed to target much slower planes.
Now this is called a combining glass because it's combining the view of the outside world with this little graticule that's projected up through here. Now what we have on here are some means for presetting the range to the target aircraft. You also have another control that gives you an estimate of the distance away to the targets, and that really was the best you could do. The limitation is that you have no measure of the movement of the target.
The Sabre, on the other hand, had a radar rangefinder that could automatically calculate the distance to the target. It was a huge advantage.
This is called a radome. It's a composite material. It's not metal skin like the fuselage. And behind this is the radar antenna. And it sent out a signal that would reflect off of a target, come back, be picked up by this antenna here, and then translated to an image up in the cockpit that would tell us whether an object was at 4,000 feet or 2,000 feet or 1,000 feet distance out. This entire radar ranging and gun sight system was a generation ahead of what was carried in the MiG-15.
The radar and gun sight made all the difference. Although the two aircraft's capabilities were closely matched on paper, the ratio of combat kills favored the Sabre by an astonishing 10-to-1. The Sabre system was just a beginning. For today's modern pilots, targeting is almost virtual. The very latest generation of helmets provides the pilot with instant information from the plane's sensors and synchronizes the sensors to the movements of the pilot's head.
Essentially, this not only comprises then of the safety element, which is to protect the pilot, but also it's there to support a helmet-mounted display.
The cockpit senses where the pilot is looking by keeping track of infrared light-emitting diodes embedded in the helmet. Wherever the pilot looks, the aircraft sensors follow.
This helmet is presenting display from sensors, and those sensors can be steered by this head tracker on the outside of the helmet, which means that whichever direction the helmet is looking in, including downwards, you can actually see the picture of the outside world. This means that in effect the pilot is actually looking through the floor of the aircraft if they look down, and this can give them a magnificent field of view.
The helmet is at the apex of technology, made possible by the plane's avionics, the crucial melding of aviation and electronics. Avionics turns the plane, pilot, and weapons into a single system. This was an essential advance during the dangerous Cold War. In 1949, when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, the Cold War went nuclear. Moscow and Washington were now in striking distance of each other with history's most powerful weapons. The world envisioned hordes of bombers armed with nuclear payloads. As both sides prepared for an attack, they realized survival would depend on one thing: reaction time. An armed warplane was needed that was so fast it could destroy approaching planes before they could reach their targets. The race was on for a supersonic interceptor.
We needed an airplane that was extremely fast, that could get supersonic speeds very, very quickly, because all it takes is one bomber getting through, because now they're carrying thermonuclear weapons. And one airplane literally could destroy an entire city. The stakes are very, very high.
America's first attempt at a supersonic interceptor was the Convair F-102 Delta Dagger, known as the Deuce. It was commissioned to exceed Mach 1 in level flight. The F-102 incorporated all the lessons that had been learned during the initial assault on the sound barrier and was designed to lead the way for the next generation of truly supersonic warplanes. But when the Deuce took to the air, its initial trials were abysmal.
They have the big engine, they're using the swept wing, they're using the Delta wing, that's just nice and thin, it should be real fast, and it should go supersonic, but when they built one, guess what? It doesn't quite go supersonic.
The experts were stumped. Their airplane had the powerful jet engine and the very latest wing design, but it simply couldn't break through. Despite the success of the Bell X-1, the sound barrier was once again seeming impenetrable. The team turned to NASA aerodynamicist Richard Whitcomb for help.
Almost all supersonic airplanes were not going supersonic because of this problem.
But what was the problem?
The thing that they failed to understand at that time was the aerodynamics. They ended up with the thickest part of the fuselage being in the middle. And then the thickest part of the wings joined that fuselage in the same place. So if you took a series of cross-sectional cuts all through the aircraft, that you would find that the area would have this large jump and bulge in the middle.
This was research scientists had already been through when they were experimenting with thick and thin wings. But it seemed they had missed one clue in the Schlieren photography.
right near the speed of sound. There weren't shock waves for the fuselage and the various parts of the airplane. There was one major shock wave, one big shock wave for the total airplane. Remember, they all converged on one.
Whitcomb realized that he shouldn't be looking at the fuselage and the wings as separate entities. Instead, he suggested they be thought of together so that their cross-section could be measured in relation to the rest of the plane.
He postulated that perhaps if you look in a more global sense of what the air had to do going around this vehicle, that if you made a Coke bottle shape, in other words, made the fuselage thinner where the wings got thicker, and smoothed out the area over the curve, that you might reduce the drag.
The theory made sense. The traditional shape looked like a bulge when expressed in a cross-section. But if the wings were attached at a point where the fuselage had been sucked in, the thick wings and thin fuselage would counterbalance each other.
It was not the individual parts, but the total cross-sectional area that counted. And by indenting the fuselage, you improve it.
Whitcomb's principle became known as the area rule. It was quickly applied to the next F-102 prototype. The modification worked. On December 19, 1954, the Deuce reached Mach 1.22. Its speed, combined with its air-to-air missiles and rockets, made the F-102 the first supersonic interceptor. After the F-102, supersonic jet planes had little trouble breaking through the sound barrier. Large moving control surfaces, digital avionics, swept wings, and better aerodynamics had all finally come together in the right way. But the impact of the jet engine was even more far-reaching. It revolutionized the fighter plane and transformed the helicopter. This is the Cobra Zulu, the latest attack helicopter to join the U.S. Marine Corps. At Patuxent River Naval Air Base in Maryland, the newest in the Cobra line of rotary-wing gunships is being outfitted and tested. The Cobra is bristling with the latest technology.
We're standing in front of AH-1Z, which is our newest Super Cobra. Now we have mission computers on this aircraft, the first time for the Cobra family. A huge leap to the 21st century since we designed these airplanes originally back in the 50s and 60s. The weapon system's all integrated on a mission grip, which looks a lot like your Atari or Xbox or PlayStation mission grip. So your kids are learning how to fly this helicopter today.
The concept of the helicopter is not a new one. Leonardo da Vinci sketched it in the 15th century. But the helicopter didn't fly until pioneers like Heinrich Fock in Germany and Ukrainian immigrant Igor Sikorsky in the USA applied 20th century technology to the idea. This is Sikorsky at the controls of his first test flight in 1939. By the 1950s, the helicopter had found a vital humanitarian role in the skies over Korea. Used for transport, it was the fastest way to retrieve injured soldiers from the front. The helicopter was a lifesaver, but its large, heavy piston engines limited its potential.
Here we have a typical radial piston engine from the 40s, early 50s. Big, bulky, heavy, lots of things to go wrong with it. And then in the mid-50s, along came the turboshaft engine, far smaller, much lighter, much simpler, and twice, 3 times as much power.
Unlike a traditional jet engine, which uses the explosive power of the jet for thrust, the turboshaft uses the power to spin a rod, which in turn drives the helicopter's rotor blades. First developed in France in 1948, the engine created entirely new possibilities for the helicopter.
You could now carry more, you had more power, and also the engines were much simpler, so they were much more reliable.
A new generation of helicopter emerged. At the forefront was the Bell UH-1, better known as the Huey. It began work doing medical evacuation in the Vietnam War.
Well, the Huey was originally designed for the air ambulance role, but it very quickly became apparent that it could do more than that.
The extra power and reliability provided by the turboshaft engine made the Huey a versatile machine.
As good as this aircraft was at bringing wounded soldiers off the battlefield, maybe it would do just as good at putting them into the battlefield to begin with. And thus the idea of vertical envelopment came about.
Vertical envelopment meant dropping troops into hot landing zones. It was a dangerous job that required extra protection and armaments. Gunners were added to the troop carriers, and gunship models were outfitted with rocket and grenade launchers and machine guns.
The problem came that the Huey, which was carrying all the armament, was slower than the helicopter which was carrying the troops. And so that was why they decided to start looking at developing a particular attack helicopter, which would be faster, which would be more streamlined, which would just carry a gunner and a pilot. And that essentially was the birth of the attack helicopter.
The AH-1 was the first true American attack helicopter. It created a powerful new role for the rotary wing warplanes and paved the way for today's modern gunships, including the Apache, the Black Hawk, and the Cobra Zulu. At various times throughout the history of military aviation, limits of technology have slowed innovation. Now, with advanced avionics and integrated systems, it is the pilots who are being forced to keep up.
Typhoon 1, wind is calm, you are cleared for takeoff.
Typhoon 1, cleared takeoff.
Before they are ever allowed to set foot in their planes, today's Top Guns spend hours in computer simulators that model every flight scenario imaginable.
This simulator in particular is used for cockpit familiarization, basic instrument flying, emergency procedures, and intercept procedures. We start out here to train the first Eurofighter pilots of the German Air Force, so it's not only a training for them to fly the aircraft, it's also a training for them to become familiar with the simulator, that they can train later on the students in the simulator.
After hundreds of simulated missions on the ground, the pilots are finally ready for their first flight. They are among the elite to fly the first Eurofighter Typhoons. After 10 years of meticulous testing, the Eurofighter finally joined its first active squadron here in Germany in 2005. The crew represents thousands of hours of training. The warplane, 100 years of technological evolution. When the cockpit is closed, the two come together in unprecedented unison. Days of flight, the plane and pilot have been intimately linked. Technology has forced pilots to adjust, and the demands of the flyers have led to ever more dramatic innovations. The jet engine was one of the biggest. It generated a shockwave that redrafted the blueprint, creating new roles for the warplane to fill. The next step would be to make the warplane invisible.
Warplane is available on DVD for $24.99 plus shipping. To order, call 1-800-336-1917 or write to the address on your screen.